Hey, I'm William Miller, author of Nobleman. I'm talking today about research. I've gotten several questions on the topic of research, when to do it, how much to do it. If you've been writing for any amount of time, you've heard the saying, "Write what you know." Creative writing teachers and websites like Writer's Digest throw that out. It's become gospel. But, is it realistic? According to the literary establishment, the woman working the counter at Starbucks has no business writing a World War II novel. The hardworking guy driving a garbage truck is only allowed to write about garbage collectors. Let me go check on my dog. And we're back. My dog, there was somebody at the door and my dog decided to just go crazy. Where were we? Picking up where we left off. Write what you know. It's both good and bad advice. Most people will never wield magic powers. They'll never travel in space. Hopefully they'll never, plan the perfect bank heist. That's where research comes in. Research is a writer's best friend. It allows us to write convincingly about places we've never been and people we've never met. How much research should you be doing for your novel, and when should you be doing that research? This is where I part ways a little bit with most writers. Every time I open up a history book, every time I turn on the History Channel, I'm doing research. And that brings me to my first point. Good research is mostly organic and it happens separate from the writing process. I've known a lot of writers who sit down to write a book and they think, I'll do all the research later. For me, when I sit down to write, I've already got a pretty good idea of the time period that I'm going to be writing it in, or the place that I'm going to be writing about, because I've done a lot of research. I've just read broadly about many subjects. I've met so many hopeful would-be authors who are gonna, they're gonna sit down and they're gonna write the next Tom Clancy bestseller submarine novels. They've never been in the Navy. They don't know a thing about submarines, and ultimately the novel they write is wildly unrealistic garbage. So you've got writers that sort of fall into one of two camps. They think they're just gonna write it and then do all the research later, or they get the idea for it and they think, okay, now I got to go do a whole bunch of research before they sit down to write. I sort of choose the hidden third option. I'm a student of history. Furthermore, I think that the serious writer should be a student of history. In order to be a good storyteller, you need a broad knowledge of the world. And I'm going to go so far as to say that if you don't like history, or at the very least current events, you've got no business trying to write. I should say all of the writers that I know, they're very switched on. They get very excited about history, current events, politics, advances in the medical field, advances in the scientific field. These are the sorts of things that get our motors running because it's where we get our story ideas from. So if that sort of thing doesn't interest you, you might want to think about a different career path. Telling stories is probably not going to be a good fit for you, because your stories aren't going to have any verisimilitude. They're not going to be realistic. That's a big sticking point for most authors. If your only interests are manga and The Walking Dead, that's going to come across loud and clear in your writing. This is especially true of writers who have never read anything but young adult fiction. All they read is YA books. And it just, you can tell in their writing. And if that's you, if I'm talking to you right now, put the kiddie book down and go take a walk through the grown-up section. All right, there's a lot of good literature out there. This applies just to reading in general. You can't just read in one genre and think, okay, I got it, now I'm going to write a book. You need to read broadly in a field of different subjects. Many inexperienced authors think they don't need to do any sort of research, they don't need to know about history, they don't need to know about politics, basic psychology, any of that. Usually these are the people that are penning fantasy epics about young adult vampire, werebear, BDSM, unicorn fanfic mashups. They think because they're writing fiction, they can just make it all up as they go. Good fiction is steeped in reality, and a lack of historical knowledge will result in a flat fictional landscape. For instance, let's say you want to write a fantasy story that takes place in a medieval-esque world. Having a firm grasp of medieval Europe is going to help you add verisimilitude to your story. When people say write what you know, what they're really saying is know what you're writing about. Take an interest in history, the arts, literature, politics, music, expand your understanding of the world, and the list of subjects you're qualified to write about expands along with it. From my own personal experiences, about 5 years ago I was reading a magazine. I don't even recall the name of it at this point, but I came across an article about the Chickasaw Light Horse Police. It's a police department out on the Indian reservation in Ada, Oklahoma, and it's just a dozen or so officers, and they're in charge of the entire reservation. I remember at the time thinking they were a lot like frontier marshals in a Wild West boomtown. It inspired me to investigate modern Indian reservations, their economics, their politics, and just learn a little bit more about the subject. I didn't even have a story that I was working on at the time. It was just something that interested me. Fast forward about 5 years later, I get inspired to write a story about a disabled sheriff's deputy investigating a murder. And while I was plotting the book, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to put the sheriff's deputy on an Indian reservation? All right. I was already familiar with the historical and cultural climate because I had already done a bunch of research on the subject. So I didn't need to sit down and do months of research before I started writing the first draft. I worked up my outline, it took me about 3 days, and within 2 months I had the first draft written. If you've already studied your subject, if you already know about what you want to write about, you don't waste months researching your story. You can just dive right in after you have an outline. Also, you won't waste time collecting irrelevant facts that don't have any bearing on the story you're trying to tell. If you don't know anything about the subject, you don't know what's important, what's not, you don't even kind of have an overview of the subject, you don't know where to begin. You're going to do a lot of research at random, hoping you collect the right facts, and you end up with a lot of useless material on your hands. Okay, so let's talk about post-first draft writing, right? You've already got a broad idea of the subject you want to write about. You've sat down, you wrote out your first draft, right? You're not going to get everything right the first time. But once you have that first draft in hand, it's easy to go through your story and just put a small mark next to any thing that you need to fact check, right? Once you've done that, compile a list of all the little details that you need to look up and open up a web browser, right? Just go down the list and start checking everything. This list of minutiae will help you easily spot check your manuscript, and that's going to keep you from getting lost in the weeds, as it were. Compare that method to researching at random, hoping you find the relevant information, and spending countless hours surfing the web only to find out later you've got some more work to do. That's why I always like to start with a solid grasp of the place and the time period that my story is going to be set in. If you start with a broad understanding of the subject, you write your first draft, and then you spot check the details, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and heartache. The authors who get an idea, they sit down and they write the first draft, and then they go back to research and actually understand their subject because they didn't know anything about it to begin with. they usually, 9 times out of 10, I should probably say 99 times out of 100, they're going to find that their first draft is pretty much useless and they have to throw it away and start again. So it's better to start with some knowledge of your subject, write the first draft, and then just spot check yourself on the details afterwards. So as far as research goes, to those people who are asking me, how much of it do I do, when do I do it, I already have a real good idea of my subject before I even start, and then I just spot check my details afterwards. Become a student of history, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time and effort in this game. After you've done your first draft, then you just do targeted research. Alright, I'm William Miller, author of Nobleman. Thanks for watching. Be sure and press the like button down here in the corner. If you've got any questions, you can just put them in the comments here, or you can go over to my website, noblevengeance.com, and shoot me an email. Love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.